We're live here from the Americans for Prosperity Foundation's Defending the American Dream Summit in Crystal City, Arlington, just outside of Washington, D.C. And a lot of interesting people here, a lot of interesting people on Blogger Row. Among them, author Leslie Carbone, who has written the book Slaying Leviathan, The Moral Case for Tax Reform. This is obviously a topic on which I've written quite a bit about at Hot Air, as well as I will be talking a bit about tax reform in tomorrow's speech. But right now I want to introduce you to Leslie Carbone. Leslie?
Hello.
It is a pleasure to speak with you, Leslie. Now, this book has actually been around for a while. It's Slaying Leviathan, The Moral Case for Tax Reform. Certainly there's a lot of economic reasons for tax reform, but what's the difference between an economic case for tax reform and a moral case for tax reform?
Well, my book argues that the purpose of government is to enforce justice by securing our rights. And tax policy over the last 100 years or so has shifted from that enforcement of rights to actually wealth redistribution, tax people who produce more and give it to others. Well, when it does this, the government is overturning its own function to enforce justice. And when it does that, it has a lot of moral consequences. First of all, it undermines the behavior that creates wealth. Now, it's virtuous behavior that builds prosperity. Hard work, saving, responsible investment, calculated risk-taking. And it's irresponsible behavior that leads to the opposite of prosperity. Laziness, sloth, not working. Unfortunately, when the government decides to seize the fruits of the labor of the people who've committed the virtuous behavior and shift it to others, it actually undermines that kind of virtuous behavior. Second of all, by reducing the amount of disposable income that the family has or the individual has, it actually reduces their moral freedom, their ability to do what they think best with their money, whether it's put their kids in a better school, take care of aging parents, whatever they think is the best use of their money, the exercise of their moral freedom, the freedom to do what they think they ought to do. That's undermined to the extent that their disposable income is substantially diminished. Then third of all, we have things like the marriage tax, which are the product of a progressive tax code, where the code actually discourages people into marriage. It encourages them to get divorced or to remain single and to cohabitate, which brings about all the social pathologies that are associated with those things. And then finally, even in cases where the government is steering people toward behavior that we generally think is good behavior, for instance, home ownership through the home mortgage deduction, what it's doing is making that choice for the family or for the individual and saying, we want to put an imprimatur on this kind of behavior, on home ownership, which is a good thing, but it's not the only good thing. And when it steers families into that kind of behavior, it's actually inserting itself into the family's own decision-making process and shifting it away from things that they might think are better for their family at that time in that situation. It could be, a safer car. It could be, a different a school, a college for their child. Like I mentioned before, taking care of elderly parents. There are all kinds of really valid, morally important alternatives that people can choose to spend their money on. But when the government, sanctions some behavior over others in the form of tax breaks, it's actually steering the family in a direction that it might not otherwise want to go.
Leslie, and of course there's a lot of background noise here, so if those of you who are listening, that's background noise. They're putting together a table with some duct tape and some apparently baling wire, but it's always fun to do these sort of things on the cuff. Leslie, you're talking about the moral case for tax reform, and I think you've talked about the case that current tax policy leads to amoral or immoral ends. But what type of tax reform are you talking about that would restore a more moral result?
The last section of my book actually talks about the different possibilities for tax reform out there. It talks about the flat tax, national sales tax, the fair tax. It also talks about estate tax reform because the estate tax is really a tax that hits the family hard. Now, I am really looking forward to the day when we're having a national debate over whether we should have a flat tax, fair tax, national sales tax, whatever. When we have got to the point where everybody understands, or the majority understands the need for fundamental tax reform, then we can start hashing out which plan it's going to be. My book was written to help people see what the problem is, why it's a problem, and to get them thinking about different ways that we can do something about it, rather than to advocate just narrowly for one specific plan.